I Am the Swarm. Author, Quantum Wizard. Chapter 301, Fighter Jets. The warship in space stood like a pestle, unmoving. 3 minutes later, a burst of fire erupted against its front reactive armor. The powerful impact pierced the thick armor, tore through several compartments, and pushed the warship several kilometers back. Seal the damaged compartments. Get us away from River Tank 223 immediately. If it explodes, I don't want to get dragged down with it, the captain shouted. The violent tremors from the impact had left every Recon crew member on edge. Fortunately, after the shaking subsided, the self-diagnostics revealed that apart from the destroyed front reactive armor and a few damaged compartments, the ship's overall structure remained intact. Its operational capabilities were unaffected. Such damage could only be considered minor. However, in its current state, the warship was no longer capable of withstanding another electromagnetic railgun round. Worse, River Tank 223, already severely damaged, appeared on the verge of destruction. Should it explode, the uncontrolled wreckage would pose a far greater threat than a railgun projectile. Unfortunately, their ship was the closest to River Tank 223. Having narrowly avoided disaster, the captain immediately ordered the ship to distance itself from this looming danger. Even without the captain's command, the crew had already begun moving. The forward engines engaged, and the warship began retreating, its stern tilted up as it pulled away from planet rays. This maneuver drew curses from nearby captains and even prompted an inquiry from Hamis, but none of it mattered compared to survival. While the main cannons on both sides exchanged fire, the smaller units were far from idle. Most of the swarm's larval bodies had transformed into fungal carpet, while the mature bodies targeted the remaining ground-based cannons. However, with the arrival of the fighter squadrons, the mature bodies now had new targets. Although their electromagnetic railguns were highly destructive, capable of downing a fighter jet with a single hit, or even taking out multiple jets with a lucky shot, their slow firing rate posed a significant drawback. After all, the mature bodies could only fire their railguns using the energy reserves within their bodies. This massive energy consumption slowed their engines, reducing their mobility. Under favorable circumstances, they could leverage their superior numbers and defenses to hold their own against the Riken squadrons in a long-range duel. However, in this case, there were only tens of thousands of mature bodies, facing fighter jets outnumbering them several times over. Faced with such odds, the mature bodies quickly found themselves at a disadvantage. Fortunately, the mature bodies were incredibly resilient. Their thick armor provided excellent resistance to the smaller caliber energy weapons used by the fighter jets. Nevertheless, the chaotic battlefield created awkward situations for both sides. Amid the exchange of main cannon fire, avoiding friendly fire became increasingly challenging. The primordial bodies had managed to avoid incidents of friendly fire, but the Riken's warships, stationed far from the core battlefield, had difficulty coordinating their main cannon strikes. Even though their energy beams traveled quickly, it still took tens of seconds to reach their targets. For the fighter jets attempting to maneuver through this intense war zone, avoiding friendly fire became an increasingly daunting task. Many Riken fighter jets were inadvertently struck by their own side's energy beams while pursuing the mature bodies. For these fragile fighter units, being hit by a warship's main cannon meant instant destruction reduced to scattered debris in an instant. Fortunately for the Riken, the majority of their fighter fleet consisted of unmanned drones. So far, all the losses from friendly fire had been limited to drones, with no casualties among their pilots. Unintentionally, the battles between the squadrons and the mature bodies began drifting away from the main combat zone, as both sides pursued their engagements elsewhere. The primordial bodies, which had suffered heavy losses during their charge on planet rays, were further reduced while resupplying on metallic elements. In terms of firing rate, projectile quantity, and the speed of their shots, the swarm's railguns were now at a disadvantage. 2 hours later, the Riken fleet had lost over 300 warships, but the number of active swarm railguns had dwindled to fewer than 500. It was only a matter of minutes before the railguns would fall silent entirely. Despite the battlefield gains, the Riken commanders felt no joy. At the start of the battle, the Riken fleet had deliberately avoided targeting the intact ground-based cannons. However, the primordial space octopuses had used the cannons as cover, forcing the fleet into a difficult position. Continuing to spare the cannons only restricted their firepower and limited their effectiveness in eliminating the swarm. After deliberations among several fleet commanders, it was decided that the fleet would no longer spare the remaining metallic constructs. Friendly fire was no longer a concern. Now, with most of the large space octopuses nearly wiped out, the ground-based cannons had suffered a damage rate exceeding 90%. But those purple-gray patches, those fleshy structures despite the relentless bombardment had not only survived but were thriving amidst the destruction. They continually repaired damaged areas and expanded outward. Meanwhile, in the aerial battle, the mature bodies found themselves relentlessly pursued by the Wrecking squadrons. Leveraging their superior speed, the Wrecking jets weaved around the mature bodies, maintaining a safe distance while firing continuously. The swarm's numbers dwindled steadily under this strategy. The Wrecking's new tactics effectively neutralized the close combat advantages of the space octopuses. Even the largest mature bodies, over 100 meters in size, couldn't withstand the sustained damage. Their structures eventually gave way, and they plummeted to the ground, losing their ability to fly. As the battle dragged on, the number of mature bodies continued to decline, while the Wrecking squadrons sustained minimal losses. The kill-to-loss ratio was so lopsided that the swarm couldn't even manage a one-to-one exchange. However, during the chase, the terrain began to change, and a range of mountains and valleys appeared ahead. The remaining mature bodies turned and dove into the complex terrain. "What do we do?" "They've gone in," a Wrecking pilot radioed his superior. "Pursue them. Send drones ahead to scout. There aren't many left, finish them off," the superior officer commanded. These pilots, who hadn't participated in the earlier T-853 campaign, relied only on recorded footage for reference. Had they experienced the battle firsthand, they would never have made such a decision. In such rugged terrain, the speed and long-range advantages of the Wrecking fighters were severely curtailed, while the combat capabilities of the space octopuses were exponentially enhanced. A squadron cautiously navigated the valleys, scanning the surroundings. The space octopuses had vanished after only a few twists and turns. The space octopus's optical cloaking technology, which had remained unused until now, finally came into play. The Wrecking's gravitational detectors struggled to perform due to the high interference in the area, combined with the relatively weak gravitational waves emitted by the mature bodies compared to the primordial bodies. Having lost track of the mature bodies, the Wrecking forces could only close in for a risky search. Suddenly, from the side of a cliff wall, a tentacle lashed out. The air shimmered with electric sparks, and the image of the space octopus appeared distorted, like a mosaic of fragmented light. The alarms of various instruments blared simultaneously, but it was too late. Not even the drones reacted in time, let alone the Wrecking pilot. With a deafening explosion, 3 fighter jets were obliterated midair. Chapter 302, Burning. The 3 destroyed aircraft were drones. The Wrecking pilot let out a cold breath, realizing that if the tentacle had been just a little longer, his craft would have also turned into a fireball. A standard formation included 10 aircraft. He quickly directed the remaining fighter jets to lock onto the target and prepare for an attack. The target was a medium-sized space octopus, over 80 meters in length with tentacles extending up to 50 meters long, enough to take out 3 aircraft in one strike. Upon being locked on, the space octopus didn't panic. Instead, it flexed its tentacles and climbed swiftly along the rocky walls, its movements agile and gelatinous, like rolling jelly. Most of the fighter jet's attacks missed, with only a few landing on its body. However, the energy weapons mounted on the jets were too small in caliber to deal significant damage to the 80-meter space octopus. To disable this creature, the jets would need to attack continuously for an extended period. But time was a luxury they didn't have. As the jets locked onto the space octopus and focused their fire, 3 other mature bodies suddenly leapt out from the cliff walls ahead. These 3 mature bodies were smaller, only about 20 meters in length, having just transitioned from larval body to mature body status. They weren't yet equipped with electromagnetic railguns, which made their smaller frames even more nimble. The sudden ambush left the jets no room to evade. The 3 mature bodies pounced, each taking down a jet and hurling them toward nearby Allied aircraft. Once again, the Wrecking pilot was fortunate not to be targeted. He quickly pulled his craft upward, prioritizing his own survival over his drone escorts. Meanwhile, the 80-meter space octopus that had initially been fleeing turned back. With its 50-meter-long tentacle flashing with electrical sparks, it swung from above with full force. The pilot's ascending jet was struck directly. Its superior build and sturdier frame spared it from immediate destruction, but the tremendous impact warped its outer shell and sent it hurtling toward the ground at an even faster speed. Boom! The jet crashed into the ground and suffered catastrophic damage, ultimately exploding into a fireball. The remaining 3 drones fared no better. 2 were destroyed in midair collisions with Allied jets under the control of the mature bodies. The last drone, attempting to ascend, was swatted out of the sky by the 80-meter space octopus's tentacle, exploding on impact. With their prey eliminated, the team of mature bodies disappeared once more into the mountainous terrain, waiting for their next victims. Scenes like this played out across the rugged landscape. The once nearly unscathed Riken squadrons saw their losses mount sharply. By the time the commanders realized the gravity of the situation, over 20,000 fighter jets had been lost. In contrast, the swarm's losses among the mature bodies were negligible. The remaining Riken aircraft were ordered to ascend to higher altitudes. However, they didn't retreat entirely but instead encircled the entire mountainous area, determined to prevent the space octopuses from escaping. On the main battlefield, the swarm forces had completely lost their ability to counterattack. Their electromagnetic railguns had all fallen silent, leaving them to endure wave after wave of bombardment. Yet, the purple-gray patches proved far more resilient than the Riken could have imagined. No matter how they attacked, the patches continued to repair and grow. Damn it! What is this thing? Conventional firepower is useless. We need another plan. Perhaps that could work. You mean? Minutes later, several gunboats departed from the Riken warships, heading toward the battlefield below. From an altitude of 10,000 meters, cylindrical metal canisters each 2 meters tall and 1.2 meters in diameter were dropped one by one. A total of over 100 canisters rained down in succession. The metal canisters plummeted quickly, and just before reaching the purple-gray patches, they detonated with a deafening roar less than 100 meters above the ground. These were the Riken's latest experimental weapons. Upon detonation, even in the vacuum of space, they burned for more than 30 seconds, thanks to advanced oxidizers contained within. During this brief time, the canisters could raise the temperature of the targeted area to over 10,000 degrees Celsius, inflicting devastating thermal damage. The oxidizers' byproducts also created a potent chemical toxin with effects comparable to intense radiation. These toxins were highly adhesive and non-biodegradable. On a life-bearing planet, such a weapon would render the affected area uninhabitable for centuries. Though the weapon's theoretical concept had long existed, the Riken had strictly prohibited its development until the expeditionary fleet's defeat. Faced with the existential threat of alien species, such forbidden weapons were revived and eventually deployed. The interception fleet carried a small number of these experimental weapons to test their effectiveness in combat. The performance of the burning barrels exceeded expectations. Over 100 of them detonated in succession, igniting what seemed like 100 miniature suns. The bright flames flickered briefly before extinguishing, but the scars they left were indelible. The purple-gray patches turned to black-brown sludge, oozing a tar-like substance. The toxins effectively stifled the growth of the fungal carpet. Look! The patches are being suppressed. It seems to be working. Too bad these are experimental. We don't have many. Use them all. Destroy as much as we can. We'll figure out something for the rest. Encouraged by the results, hundreds more gunboats launched from the warships. In moments, even more miniature suns lit up the battlefield. Though these were only experimental weapons and each warship carried a limited stock, there were over 2,000 warships on site. The cumulative number of burning barrels became significant. On a life-bearing planet, such concentrated detonations could lead to the extinction of species with delicate environmental needs. However, Planet Ray's, located in the outermost reaches of the star system, was barren and uninhabited, allowing the Riken to unleash their weapons without hesitation. Thousands upon thousands of burning barrels detonated, severely slowing the fungal carpet's repair and growth. However, it was only a delay. A few hours later, as the Riken focused their bombardments on regions not yet touched by the barrels, the areas affected by the toxins began to recover. The fungal carpet was the culmination of Luo Wen's mastery, a distilled essence of every genetic fragment he had collected. Its rich genetic features allowed it to adapt to various crises and challenges, consistently demonstrating exceptional resilience. The extreme temperatures produced by the burning barrels over 10,000 degrees Celsius were hardly a threat to the fungal carpet. After all, atomic furnaces, integral components of the carpet, could withstand temperatures exceeding millions of degrees during fusion reactions. The scorching heat from the barrels was easily mitigated by a slight mutation in the fungal carpet's surface cells. What truly inhibited its growth were the chemical toxins left behind by the barrels. To the fungal carpet, these toxins were akin to feces, repulsive and difficult to digest. This was the primary reason it appeared hesitant to advance. Chapter 303, Fungal carpet adaptations. Under external stimuli, certain deeply embedded genetic fragments within the fungal carpet were activated. These genes caused parts of the carpet to mutate, enabling them to break down otherwise indigestible toxins and convert them into delicious nutrients. Look at those patches. Don't they seem like they've recovered a bit? An observer suddenly asked in confusion. That's impossible. The main components of those toxic substances are high molecular compounds formed through polymerization reactions. Even without their toxic effects, these compounds are nearly impossible to degrade. Unless they're removed, this land is essentially rendered useless, replied another crew member, who had a more thorough understanding of incendiary bombs. But I swear, those dark brown patches have definitely shrunk, the observer insisted, confident in his keen eyesight and natural aptitude for distance measurements, which rarely led him astray. Using both hands, he overlaid two images of the same area taken 2 hours apart. The black-brown toxic patches were marked with two distinct colors of dotted lines for comparison. Once the images fully overlapped, it became evident that the toxic area had visibly shrunk since the earlier photo. Damn! It's true. These things are actually recovering, exclaimed the astonished crew member. Report this to the captain immediately. In wartime, the efficiency of the Riken was remarkable. Within 2 minutes, the fleet commanders of all three major fleets were informed. What they had hoped would be a game-changing new weapon had merely succeeded in temporarily slowing the fungal carpet's growth. Time marched on, and 2 hours passed quietly. Report, Commander. We've carefully analyzed and compared the previous footage and conducted 2 additional hours of observation. Regrettably, the fungal carpet is indeed regenerating and at an increasing speed. At this rate, it might fully recover to its previous size within another 2 hours. Hearing this, Hamis wore a grim expression. It was now clear that the purple-gray tissue was not only resistant to extreme temperatures but also possessed extraordinary decomposition capabilities. It wasn't just the toxins being broken down. The ground-based cannons, though covered by the carpet, were, according to external data, being rapidly dissolved. These organisms had an exceptional capacity for digestion. While the exact nature of their enemy remained unclear, it didn't matter for now. When the space octopuses had attacked planet rays, many had been destroyed, leaving fragments of their bodies floating in orbit. Some of these fragments had already been retrieved. Additionally, after eliminating much of the surface electromagnetic railgun fire, the Riken forces had extracted some samples from the planet's surface. The onboard research team was conducting urgent experiments and analyses. They were confident that they would soon uncover some answers. However, due to the lack of specialized research vessels in this operation, the available instruments aboard the warships were relatively rudimentary. Otherwise, they might have already identified what these organisms truly were. The bombardment continued. While ordinary energy weapons could not completely annihilate the purple-gray patches of the fungal carpet, they did manage to slow its growth. As the dominant species in their star system, the Riken had not encountered an equal rival for a long time. Even internal conflicts, when they occurred, were relatively small in scale. As a result, the troops gathered for this campaign consisted almost entirely of recruits with no real combat experience. Under these circumstances, what better opportunity for training could they ask for? Although thousands of mature bodies were still hidden in the hilly region, the rest of the swarm had lost the ability to counterattack. Actual combat against such an opponent was vastly superior to mere simulated drills. Fighter squadrons surrounding the hill region rotated in and out of the main battlefield, participating in the bombing campaign. They practiced various attack maneuvers, diving for a strike followed by rapid ascents, maintaining distance while launching sustained fire, and so on. Time passed, with fighters returning periodically to the orbital fleet for refueling and minor repairs before rejoining the drills. What the hell is going on? A ship's recreational room had been repurposed into a crude, makeshift laboratory. A frustrated researcher stared at the scene playing out before him for the umpteenth time, letting out a cry of exasperation. On the lab bench, a piece of purple-gray fungal carpet slowly dissolved into a viscous fluid, pooling across the table. The Riken researchers, their eyes bloodshot from more than 70 sleepless hours, were at their breaking point. Whether their condition was due to exhaustion or frustration was unclear. The fleet commanders of the three major fleets, the Homeworld's War Command Center, and a host of related personnel were all anxiously awaiting their results. But the researchers weren't just failing to deliver results, they were stuck at the very first step. The scientists had discovered that the alien organisms consisted of two distinct components, a normal tissue structure and a mysterious core. The normal tissue was just that, ordinary. It primarily contained nutrients, with some protective cells on the exterior. While these cells offered minor technological insights, they were only superficial due to differences in technological paradigms. The real mystery lay in the core technology of these alien constructs, their bioelectromagnetic railguns, bioplasma engines, biological fusion organs, and other incredible features. Each core was both an individual organ and part of an integrated system. Any attempt to probe their secrets triggered a chain reaction. Simply attempting to extract cells from the core caused immediate self-destruction. Despite employing every conceivable method, the researchers hit the same wall. Regardless of the tool or technique used to sample the core, the process inevitably triggered cellular collapse. Within moments, the once intact tissue dissolved into a foul-smelling liquid devoid of any usable information. Even extreme measures like rapid freezing, bringing the temperature close to absolute zero, failed to halt this self-destruction. The rationale was clear: these organisms had survived and thrived in the near-absolute zero void of space between star systems. Low temperatures were simply not a viable deterrent. How is this even possible? The researchers muttered to themselves. Based on the organism's behavior, any damage, even the impact of a shell, triggered the same self-dissolution. Yet these creatures could traverse the void of space, engage in high-intensity combat, and withstand energy cannon fire. This defied all logic. Unless, of course, their cells had some form of embedded protection programming. But how did they distinguish between external conditions deciding which attacks warranted defense and which required self-destruction? Could they possess a form of consciousness? If so, every organ, perhaps even every cell, would need its own awareness. But how could that be possible? Especially now that these organisms were dead. Even if they had once possessed consciousness, it should no longer exist. Chapter 304, Helpless. The Riken researchers were utterly baffled. The phenomenon exceeded their knowledge and understanding, leaving them no choice but to attribute it to the peculiarities of biotechnology. What now? If this continues, we won't be able to deliver any results, one researcher muttered, staring at the purple-gray substance before him, which had once again undergone genetic collapse. His own composure seemed close to breaking as well. There's no other choice but to tell the truth. We lack the relevant theoretical foundation. Their understanding of biotechnology far surpasses ours, and we simply cannot decipher their creations, an older researcher sighed. Let's hope the incoming research vessels can provide some assistance, another researcher said with cautious optimism. These research vessels were equipped with the most advanced scientific instruments available. Constructed in response to feedback from the expeditionary fleet, they were purpose-built to tackle challenges like these. Transporting the precision instruments from the Riken homeworld to these vessels had been a monumental effort. During earlier battles, the research vessels hadn't accompanied the fleet, but now that the Riken had gained control of the battlefield, the fleet commander had urgently dispatched 2 vessels to the front lines. After several days of travel, they were just a few hours away from arriving. Compared to the makeshift labs on the warships, the research vessels boasted far superior facilities. It's doubtful they'll help much. What's limiting us isn't the instruments, the older researcher said, pointing to his own head. The limitation lies here. That's not entirely true, another senior researcher retorted. There might be instruments capable of bypassing their defenses. You can't even grasp the underlying theories. How do you plan to break through? Maybe brute force could work. You think this is some cheap door lock? This is the most sophisticated genetic lock imaginable. Ha, unexpected breakthroughs happen all the time. Unexpected? Do you even know what that word means? And besides, science is methodical. There's no such thing as unexpected in proper science. Nonsense. How many technological advancements were born from accidents? The argument grew increasingly heated. The 2 older researchers were on the verge of physical confrontation when their juniors hurriedly stepped in to separate them. Let's not go that far. It's not worth it. Their assistants managed to defuse the situation just as it seemed ready to escalate into a brawl. You go, the more composed senior suddenly said after a moment of silence. What? The argumentative researcher looked confused, unsure of the seemingly out-of-context statement. Go report to the commander. The argumentative researcher froze for a moment before realizing what was being said. He immediately flew into a rage. Why don't you go? You think I'm stupid, the composed researcher retorted. What, so you think I'm the idiot here? Hearing this, the argumentative elder's hair stood on end. Seeing tempers flare again, the peacemaker elder hurriedly interjected. All right, all right. Enough arguing. I'll go. Will that work for you? With a sigh, he shook his head and left the lab. Meanwhile, the two quarrelsome elders exchanged a glance, then broke into knowing smiles, their differences momentarily forgotten. What? You're telling me it's like there's a locked door, and after all these days, you haven't even figured out how to open it? Elsa roared. The peacemaker elder, whose name was Prez, shrank back instinctively. Among the three fleet commanders, Hamis of the First Fleet was known for his relatively mild temperament, making him the ideal candidate for receiving the report. However, upon connecting to the comms, Prez found himself unexpectedly added to a small meeting. Apart from the three fleet commanders, the meeting included only a few senior officers, totaling no more than 20 participants. Conveniently or perhaps intentionally, they had just been discussing the alien organisms. The alien creations had endured relentless bombardment for days yet remained resilient, refusing to be entirely eradicated. With the war effort temporarily less intense, the commanders, stationed in planetary orbit, had little else to do but hold meetings to pass the time. Unsurprisingly, most of their discussions revolved around the current situation and the mysterious alien organisms. When Prez arrived to deliver the research team's findings, Hamis immediately pulled him into the group chat. After nervously explaining the research progress or lack thereof, Prez faced Alcer's angry outburst. While the laboratory leads were later called to account for the situation, including the two argumentative elders, it quickly became clear that this issue couldn't be solved by mere scolding. The real obstacle lay in the Riken's complete unfamiliarity with and inability to comprehend the alien technology. Even after the arrival of the research vessels, equipped with cutting-edge instruments and far superior facilities, the problem persisted. Regardless of the methods or tools used, the Riken were unable to bypass the genetic locks of the swarm's creations. If they used tools for purposes other than probing, the alien organism's genetic material remained stable. But the moment they attempted any form of analysis, no matter how subtle, even with a needle-thin probe, the alien organisms immediately triggered genetic collapse, dissolving into a foul-smelling fluid. This paradox perplexed the Riken researchers. If they couldn't overcome such an intelligent defensive mechanism, their efforts would be futile. What the Riken failed to realize was that what they perceived as a passive defense was actually an active defense system. Within the swarm network, Luowen had deployed a significant number of Hive Queen consciousnesses to monitor the fungal samples collected by the Riken. At the first sign of suspicious activity, the Queens activated the self-destruction protocols for the fungal strains. This fundamental misunderstanding rendered all of the Riken's efforts useless, a source of endless frustration. While their research efforts stalled, new developments were unfolding on the battlefield of planet Rays. Under relentless attacks, many emergency genes within the fungal carpet were activated. The continuous cycle of destruction and regeneration led to adaptations, enhancing the fungi's resistance to the Riken's assaults. Though the cost of producing the new defensive structures was higher, the fungal roots had already extended several kilometers underground. This vastly improved energy collection capabilities, enabling them to sustain the increased resource demand. The new defenses not only resisted the Riken's energy attacks more effectively but also absorbed the residual energy from explosions at an accelerated rate. With these enhancements, the purple-gray patches not only survived the intense bombardment but also fully repaired themselves and rapidly expanded their occupied territory. They're growing so fast. Hamis's face darkened as he reviewed the data. In truth, detailed analyses were unnecessary. Simple before and after images revealed the stark changes. We can't continue attacking like this. Not only have they become significantly more resistant, but they're also absorbing the energy from our attacks, remarked Noval, the Second Fleet commander. While direct data from the space octopus's interiors was inaccessible, external monitoring tools remained functional. Instruments deployed on the battlefield detected an abnormal shift in energy flow. When energy beams struck the ground, the explosions no longer dispersed outward randomly. Instead, the energy became directional, concentrated toward the fungal carpet. This anomalous energy flow made it glaringly obvious what was happening. Chapter 305, Purge. We must destroy them in one decisive blow. Prolonged attrition is not an option, Hamis said with a furrowed brow. It seems we'll need to use that, Noval replied gravely. Haha. It's about time. Why hesitate? Weapons are made for moments like this. Alcer laughed heartily. The three highest commanders on the front line reached a consensus, and the orders were quickly dispatched. To simultaneously strike at the dozens of battlefields across planet rays, over 100 warships stationed in orbit gradually opened the missile silos on the lower sides of their hulls. Towering missiles, 35 meters tall with a diameter of 7.6 meters and cone-shaped tips, emerged from the silos. Each warship launched at least 2 of these massive projectiles. The missiles accelerated steadily as their fire control systems activated, locking onto their designated targets with assistance from the warship's artificial intelligence. Minutes later, hundreds of miniature suns ignited on planet rays. Unlike incendiary bombs, these suns burned relentlessly. These were the Reich's newly deployed nuclear weapons. This new generation of nuclear weapons utilized a significantly more potent structure and formula. In addition to the energy released from nuclear fission, the outer shell of each missile was coated with radioactive materials. The high temperatures from the fission reaction initiated a second fusion process, unleashing even greater energy. The Reich had perfected the underlying theories of these weapons long ago. Although they had previously manufactured such weapons, their immense destructive power, extreme danger, and storage challenges led to their decommissioning. After the unification of the Reich, there was little need for such armaments until the emergence of the swarm. Compared to the 200 megaton nuclear devices the Reich had previously detonated in the neighboring star system, these new weapons boasted a staggering yield of 1 gigaton. When hundreds of these superweapons detonated simultaneously, the absence of an atmosphere to generate shockwaves did little to diminish their devastating impact. The sheer power annihilated everything within dozens of kilometers of each detonation site. At the epicenters, within tens of kilometers of the blasts, everything whether rock, dust, metal, ground-based cannons, or the fungal carpet was vaporized into nothingness. All that remained were massive, hemispherical craters. The hundreds of miniature suns burned for an extended time before finally extinguishing, leaving planet rays riddled with craters. The once persistent purple-gray patches that had so troubled the Reich vanished without a trace. Gazing at the now scarred surface of planet rays, Hamis sighed softly. Hearing the sigh during their video call, Alcer quipped, "What's this? Feeling sorry for our enemy?" Hamis shook his head. "I just didn't expect it would come to this." Truth be told, this new type of nuclear weapon was far less sophisticated than the energy beam main cannons. Yet Hamis found the weapon deeply unsettling not because of its power. Alcer, a staunch believer in the philosophy that weapons were meant to be used, understood Hamis's concern. He fell silent briefly before murmuring, "Don't overthink it. Focus on the present. If we can't survive now, there's no future to worry about." When Godzilla unleashed its atomic breath on the Great Dawn planet, its yield barely reached tens of kilotons. Yet even from another star system, the Reich had been able to observe the event through their instruments. Thus, the Reich were acutely aware of the dangers posed by such weapons. Each spiral galaxy contained hundreds of billions of stars, suspended in the void. Among them lay countless civilizations of varying levels, each hidden within their own star systems, oblivious to the others' locations. But an abnormal fusion reaction was akin to broadcasting a civilization's coordinates. It was an open invitation to any nearby civilization capable of detecting such energy waves. When the Reich detonated hundreds of 200 megaton nuclear devices in the neighboring star system, their aim had not only been to hinder the swarm's pursuit but also to expose the coordinates of the swarm's home star system. If the event drew the attention of civilizations of a similar level nearby, causing them to investigate and create trouble for the swarm, it would give the Reich the breathing room they desperately needed to regroup and develop. This outcome would be ideal. However, such actions also carried significant risks, such as attracting more advanced civilizations. After eliminating the swarm, those civilizations would likely turn their attention to the Reich next. In that case, the Reich could only hope that the swarm was strong enough to buy them some time for development. Even though it had been decades since the last nuclear detonations, the danger could not be entirely ruled out. If a civilization's travel speed remained below the speed of light, it would be entirely normal for them to spend decades or even centuries en route. Perhaps, right now, one or several civilizations had already been drawn by the last nuclear explosions and were on their way to investigate. This time, however, the nuclear detonations on planet rays were on an even grander scale. If Godzilla's atomic breath was akin to lighting a match in the dark, and the neighboring star system's nuclear blasts were like setting off a firework in the night sky, then this nuclear event was equivalent to firing a flare into the darkness, one bright enough to overshadow the fireworks entirely. If there were spectators drawn by the fireworks, they would undoubtedly shift their attention to this flare and come to investigate. The problem was that the location of this nuclear event, planet rays, was a planet in the Reckon's home star system. This posed a significant risk. But as Alcer had pointed out, if alien forces from the T85 star system were to seize planet Reyes, they would establish a foothold in the Recon star system. Coupled with their mysterious and unpredictable technological systems, the Recon would likely face certain defeat. As a vanquished civilization, what future would there be to consider? Thus, the Recon had no choice but to focus on the present. Fortunately, after paying such a steep price, the persistent purple-gray patches, which clung to the planet like parasitic maggots, were finally eradicated from planet Reyes. The Recon refused to believe that any of the alien monstrosities could still exist within the vaporized, hemispherical craters left behind. Thanks to the design of the newly equipped nuclear warheads, which reacted with their radioactive materials in a secondary reaction, the explosions left no lingering radiation zones. Compared to previous iterations, these were remarkably clean. Without the complications of high radiation areas, there was no need for additional radiation suits, allowing reconstruction efforts on planet Reyes to commence swiftly after the battle. According to forward lookouts, the swarm's next wave of forces had already begun amassing near the asteroid belt on the outskirts of the Recon star system. The Recon needed to restore all or at least part of their defensive infrastructure before the swarm's next attack. Massive transport ships and utility vessels streamed in from within the star system, delivering enormous quantities of engineering equipment to planet Reyes. Mining facilities, smelting centers, and ground cannon production plants were rapidly constructed across the planet. Once the initial setup phase was complete, a steady flow of components was transported to various locations on the planet. Airships carrying intelligent engineering machinery shuttled back and forth, assembling the components piece by piece. Meanwhile, in the planet's orbit, vacuum smelting facilities and shipyards were also taking shape. Chapter 306, Back Again. The three main fleets sustained heavy losses in this battle, with nearly 500 warships rendered incapable of long-range travel, over 80 of which were completely destroyed. Most of these losses occurred during the final stages, in the exchange of fire between orbiting Recon warships and the swarm's primordial bodies on planet Reyes' surface. Other warships also suffered varying degrees of damage, though none were critically impaired. After the war, the relatively intact Third Fleet was assigned to monitor the swarm's follow-up forces. Taking advantage of the smaller number of swarm units, they sought opportunities to exploit the situation. Even if they couldn't destroy a significant amount of the swarm's forces, depleting the swarm's ammunition stockpiles would be a worthwhile effort. In the Recon's understanding, the swarm lacked logistical bases, making replenishments difficult. The Second Fleet, which sustained moderate losses, was stationed on planet Reyes to defend the logistical engineering units and the damaged warships. Once the orbital shipyards on planet Reyes were fully operational, the Second Fleet would undergo repairs and then relieve the Third Fleet, allowing them to return for maintenance. Planet Reyes' orbital shipyards were also tasked with repairing heavily damaged warships, salvaging the remains of destroyed ships, and constructing new warships to replenish the main fleets as needed. The First Fleet, which had battled the swarm for over 10 days, suffered the heaviest losses. Including the warships grounded on planet Reyes, the First Fleet had lost nearly half of its operational strength. They would return to the Twin Star defensive zone of the Recon home system for repairs, receive reinforcements to restore their composition, and prepare for future engagements. At the same time, Vice Admiral Hames, who had participated in the entire campaign, would return to the Recon home world to report on the war. Everything was proceeding in an orderly fashion for both the Recon and the swarm. Time flew by. The Recon and the swarm maintained a relative peace, with only low-intensity skirmishes occurring in the asteroid belt on the outskirts of the Recon star system. Initially, the Recon capitalized on the destruction of the swarm's first wave of 5,000 primordial bodies at planet Reyes. Before the swarm could regroup, the Recon leveraged their numerical superiority, securing significant advantages. At one point, the swarm forces even retreated to a position farther from the Recon star system to regroup. However, the swarm had initially deployed 30,000 primordial bodies toward the Recon star system. Despite losing 5,000, over 20,000 remained. In less than a year, the swarm's primordial bodies in the Recon star system had replenished their numbers, once again surpassing 1,000. This made it difficult for any single Recon fleet to achieve further tactical victories. The Recon then shifted their strategy to circling the swarm force's perimeter, feigning advances to exhaust the swarm's ammunition, mimicking the earlier attritional battles between the First Fleet and the swarm. However, the current positions of both sides were vastly different, and this strategy no longer yielded the desired results. By now, the swarm had grown significantly stronger. They no longer feared the approach of Riken warships. For the Riken, closing into range of the swarm's main cannons also meant placing themselves dangerously close to the swarm's forces. At such distances, victory was uncertain. If they managed to win, all would be well. But if they lost, they would find themselves in an inescapable dilemma. Advancing meant inevitable defeat, while retreating along predetermined routes drastically reduced maneuverability and increased the likelihood of being hit. How many ships could escape after retreating was anyone's guess. Thus, after the Riken feigned several advances and noticed no reaction from the swarm forces, they awkwardly withdrew. From then on, the two sides simply stared at each other across the void, as the swarm forces continued to grow in size. Apart from feeling anxious, the Riken had no better solutions. Years passed, and as primordial bodies from the neighboring star system arrived one after another, the swarm forces regrouped, their numbers exceeding 10,000. They're becoming active again. It seems war is about to break out, Hamis sighed as he watched the video feed before him. The first fleet was stationed on planet Ray's outer orbit for repairs. This area, being near the front line, had been fortified into a forward stronghold against the swarm. After completing repairs and receiving newly constructed warships, the first fleet grew to over 1,000 vessels. When Hamis returned to the front line brimming with confidence to relieve the second fleet and harass the swarm forces, he had hoped for a decisive victory. Unfortunately, by then, the number of primordial bodies had already exceeded 3,000. With only 1,000 Riken warships, a direct confrontation would have resulted in mutual destruction at best. In the end, after losing dozens of warships, Hamis retreated in defeat. This poor decision, though costly, did not result in harsh punishment due to wartime circumstances. However, Hamis lost the chance to command offensive operations. As a result, the First Fleet became a permanent fixture at the planet Ray's base, a status quo that had persisted until now. But now, after years of relative quiet, the swarm forces seemed to have awakened from their slumber and grown active once more. As Hamis expected, the new swarm contingent was over twice as large as the previous force, with more than 10,000 units. From the moment they stirred to their departure, the process took merely a month. Meanwhile, the Third Fleet, tasked with long-range monitoring of the swarm forces, dared not make any aggressive moves and maintained their distance beyond the swarm's firing range, shadowing them cautiously. The Riken were not panicked by this swarm offensive, as they had long anticipated it. Over the past decade, Planet Ray's defensive systems had recovered to 80% of their pre-war capacity. Despite this partial recovery, the dense array of ground-based cannons still provided formidable firepower for the Riken. Along the swarm's anticipated advance route, the Riken had deployed a large number of smart mines, hoping to slow the swarm's advance and perhaps eliminate part of their force. While this plan was sound in theory, it proved difficult to execute in practice. The swarm appeared to have overcome their previous poor eyesight issues. The stealth coating on the smart mines was no longer effective, and the swarm forces dispatched small and medium-sized combat units to clear the minefields as they advanced. Although the smart mines were equipped with remote detonation capabilities and propulsion systems, they were unable to evade the close-range electromagnetic railgun fire from the swarm. The small mature bodies proved to be the perfect units for mine clearance. From a safe distance, typically around 10 kilometers, these units targeted the smart mines, remaining just outside their active detection range while using their electromagnetic cannons to destroy them. At such distances, the smart mines' propulsion systems had no chance of evading the artillery shells. Small explosions, like bursts of fireworks, dotted the swarm's advance path, almost as if celebrating their march. Watching this, the Riken forces' morale began to crumble. Noval, under normal circumstances, if flaws in your fleet's design were exposed during combat, what would you do? Hamis, stationed in the frontline command center on planet Ray's, furrowed his brow as he suddenly posed this question to Noval, the Second Fleet's commander standing beside him. Chapter 307, Attack. Seeing Hamis frowning in thought, seemingly asking himself questions, Noval pondered for a moment before replying, I would probably record it and report it back. And then what happens next in the process? Hamis pressed. This time, Noval also took a while to think. I haven't paid much attention to this before, but I suppose the issue would be sent to the Academy or a similar research department. They would analyze the flaws and make improvements. If there are results, the solutions would then be passed on to the space shipyards. These improvements would be reflected in the warships produced in the future. And what about the warships produced before then? That would depend on the severity of the issue. If it's a minor problem, perhaps the engineers on board could resolve it. But if it's a structural flaw, those ships might have to be sent back to the shipyard in batches for upgrades and repairs. Noval shrugged, starting to grasp Hamiz's line of thinking. So, in their eyes, is the stealth coding flaw of the smart minds a major issue or a minor one? That, I don't know. Noval shook his head. Our intelligence indicates that the swarm forces we're about to face were sent out over 20 years ago. This means these forces have spent most of that time drifting through the void, where there are no swarm shipyards, Hamiz said after some thought. But the previous swarm units couldn't detect the smart minds. Now, however, this new force seems to completely ignore their stealth coding. This suggests one of two possibilities: either this issue was considered a minor flaw by the swarm, which is unlikely, as radar upgrades are complex and not easily executed unnoticed, or the swarm was acting all along, Noval interjected, continuing Hamiz's line of thought. They've been able to detect the smart minds from the beginning. They only pretended not to notice to lower our guard, using our trap to enter planet rays. Their actions align with this theory. They probably didn't expect us to detonate so many new nuclear warheads, though. Despite their differing personalities, all three fleet commanders, including the irritable Alcer, were sharp individuals. Their current positions were not attained through mere luck. That could very well be the case. But if the swarm is this cunning, and nuclear weapons are relatively low-tech, they must have accounted for such variables. Would you, under these circumstances, recklessly sacrifice large numbers of troops? Hamiz asked, his brows furrowing deeply. Noval thought carefully for a moment before responding. It would depend on what could be gained. If the reward was significant enough, I might take the risk. But is planet rays worth such a gamble? Even without us using nuclear weapons, planet rays is still our territory. How long could the swarm hold out without support? As he spoke, doubts began to surface in Noval's mind as well. Exactly. That's what puzzles me. The risks and rewards don't align, yet the swarm proceeded anyway. If we assume they're not idiots, then this means their actions must have. Hamiz trailed off, his voice growing quieter as he sank into deep thought. Could it be that their true objective isn't planet rays? Noval asked, growing increasingly uncertain as he mulled it over. I don't know either, but there must be something we're missing. Their forces waited for so long without moving, only to act now. I can't shake this feeling of unease, Hamiz replied gravely. Perhaps they've already achieved their real objective. If that's the case, and we don't even know what it is, it bodes poorly for us, Noval said, his face dark with concern. Let's hope we're overthinking it. But we should pass these theories to Alcer and advise him to exercise extra caution on the front lines. Meanwhile, we must bolster our own vigilance, especially around planet rays, to guard against potential surprises. Noval nodded in agreement. I'll notify him. The Third Fleet's efforts to delay the swarm forces' advance proved almost entirely ineffective once the smart minds failed and they dared not venture too close. Under such circumstances, continuing to linger there was pointless. It was more prudent to return to the defensive base on planet rays for maintenance, ensuring optimal combat readiness to face the swarm forces' arrival. The trajectory of the swarm forces had already been calculated. Their target was clear and undisguised. While the swarm forces could have bypassed the defenses around planet rays, they deliberately chose not to. Instead, they made a slight detour, arriving at the planet's orbital path just as planet rays itself reached that point in its revolution. Their target remains planet rays. What exactly is drawing them here? Perhaps they simply want to establish a forward base, Noval speculated, though he didn't believe his own suggestion. Planet rays was only the 9th planet in the Reincarnated star system. Further out was the 10th planet, smaller but still suitable as a foothold. Moreover, the Reincarnated had minimal defensive installations there, making it an easier target. Yet the swarm's persistence toward planet rays suggested there was another purpose. I can't shake this ominous feeling, Hamiz murmured. Meanwhile, on the swarm side, Sarah observed the well-prepared Reincarnated defenses. Before them lay not only the three main fleets and planet rays' ground-based defense systems, but also a newly constructed orbital defense ring. The ring was armed with numerous orbital railguns, while smart mines littered several of the routes leading to planet rays. They're pulling out all the stops. But this planet is ours. Drive them off. Sarah commanded decisively. With her order, over 10,000 primordial bodies surged forward. Amidst flickering arcs of electricity, tens of thousands of electromagnetic railguns erupted in unison, initiating the attack with their superior range. Electromagnetic projectiles, apart from emitting faint light and sound upon launch, traveled silently and invisibly during flight. However, with the Reincarnated's current technological capabilities, the moment the projectiles were fired, they were detected. Their trajectories were calculated in real time using a variety of parameters. In open areas where guerrilla tactics could be employed, these projectiles were relatively easy to evade. But in this entrenched battlefield, the effectiveness of the electromagnetic railguns was magnified exponentially. Unlike warships, the orbital railguns and ground-based cannons defending planet rays were far less maneuverable and lacked the ability to dodge incoming fire effectively. Fortunately for the Reincarnated, they had anticipated such an eventuality. The orbital cannons had been strategically concealed on the far side of planet rays and its satellites, lying in wait to emerge and defend once the swarm forces came within range. Thus, during the first wave of attacks, it was the defensive installations at the rearmost positions of planet rays' defensive line that bore the brunt of the swarm's assault. Chapter 308, The Defensive Array. Over the years, the Reincarnated have dedicated considerable effort to countering the swarm's electromagnetic railguns. They had acquired an advanced starship from an unknown civilization and reverse-engineered many of its technologies. This high vantage point allowed them to refine several foundational theories. Since the expeditionary fleet's defeat, the Reincarnated spent decades developing countermeasures. However, most of these were experimental prototypes and hadn't yet reached the stage of equipping their regular forces. During the reconstruction of planet rays, however, the Reincarnated introduced a new type of defensive installation. Surrounding the ground-based cannons were structures that rivaled them in size. These buildings were semi-spherical, resembling inverted bowls embedded into the ground. At the top of the semi-spheres lay peculiar structures composed of special metals and transparent crystalline materials. These buildings lacked any familiar cannon barrels, leaving their purpose a mystery. As the swarm's dense barrage of electromagnetic projectiles approached, they seemed unstoppable, cutting through everything like an invincible sword. The Reincarnated warships scrambled to evade, unwilling to stand in their path. However, when the projectiles crossed planet rays' near orbit, closing to within just over 1,000 kilometers of their ground targets, something unexpected happened. From the tops of the semi-spherical buildings, fine red beams of light suddenly shot out of the crystalline structures. At a distance of just over 1,000 kilometers, the electromagnetic projectiles, traveling at incredible speeds, would reach their targets almost instantly. Yet, these red beams moved even faster. At first glance, they resembled significantly thinner plasma beams, but in principle and effect aside from the color they were entirely different. Plasma beams are compressed energy aggregates, whose stability can be manipulated to achieve two modes, a stable penetrative type or an unstable explosive type. Regardless of the mode, they manifest externally as energy beams ranging from tens of centimeters to several meters in length. In contrast, these thin beams, or more aptly, rays, were fundamentally different. They truly were thin lines of light, stretching for thousands of kilometers when fired. To maintain their destructive power, the thin lines required continuous energy supply. Despite their slender appearance, their energy consumption per unit of time was astronomical. Each of these semi-spherical installations consumed as much energy as 10 ground-based cannons when operational. Buried 100 meters below these installations were dedicated nuclear power plants to provide the energy they required. Even with such immense power supply, the effective attack range of these installations was less than 2,000 kilometers. High energy consumption and limited range on the surface, these weapons seemed to have significant drawbacks. The Reincarnated wouldn't deploy such flawed weapons unless they offered clear advantages. And their advantage was that they were genuine ray weapons. Their attack speed was effectively equal to the speed of light. Within their effective kill radius, their strikes were essentially instantaneous, leaving virtually no room for evasion. The swarm's long-range electromagnetic railguns, with projectiles taking over half an hour to reach their targets, had their trajectories precisely calculated long before arrival. When the projectiles entered the laser defense array's attack range, aided by large-scale supercomputers, the red beams of light instantly illuminated their targets. Electromagnetic projectiles were simply aggregates of metallic elements, not composed of advanced materials. Under the immense energy output of the red beams, they were heated to their boiling point in less than a second. The portion of the projectile exposed to the beam emitted a golden glow before liquefying and splattering in flight. As more of the projectile melted, its high-speed trajectory destabilized, and its structural integrity was lost. Once the beam burned through the projectile, it fragmented into several pieces and decelerated significantly. While the remaining fragments could still deal some damage, they were unlikely to penetrate the outer defenses of steel constructs. A few minutes later, the interception report was compiled. In the first wave of tens of thousands of electromagnetic projectiles, the laser defense array achieved a success rate of over 70%. The remaining 30% failure was attributed to the insufficient number of laser installations. If there had been enough, it's likely no projectile could have breached this layer of defense. The results are good. If I'd known, we should have built more of these things, commented Alcer, the Third Fleet's commander, with a hint of regret. They're still experimental prototypes, Noval replied with some regret of his own. They haven't undergone combat testing, and construction is challenging with extremely complex material requirements. Reaching the current scale already took considerable effort. It's unfortunate that these things consume so much energy and space. For now, they can only be used as ground-based defenses. If we could mount them on warships, we'd have a decisive advantage in battles, observed Hamis, looking further into the future. Indeed. We need to push the Academy to prioritize upgrading these laser defense arrays. With their cooperation and close-in defense cannons, we might even be able to retake the T-8 5-star system, Noval added. Currently, in their war with the Swarm, the Reckon occupied only one position of advantage across 3 engagement ranges. Long range, the Swarm's railguns outranged the Reckon's main cannons, forcing the Reckon to endure relentless bombardment without retaliation. Mid-range, once within range of the Reckon's main cannons, the fleets engaged in mutual bombardment. Here, the Reckon's faster firing rates and projectile speeds gave them a clear edge when fleet numbers were roughly equal. Close range, the Swarm's mature bodies and larval bodies posed a severe threat, charging fearlessly. If these units breached a warship's hull, survival was virtually impossible. If the laser defense arrays could be mounted on warships, the Reckon could neutralize long-range electromagnetic railgun strikes and bolster close-range defenses. Combined with laser arrays, close-in defense cannons, and fighter squadrons, the Swarm's mature and larval bodies could be effectively repelled. By preventing the Swarm from closing in, the warship's secondary cannons could unleash their firepower, which remained highly lethal against small and medium combat units. With these changes, the Reckon could potentially establish dominance at all 3 engagement ranges. Under this scenario, a counter-offensive to retake the T-8 5-star system seemed plausible. However, war was a battle of resources and logistics. The Swarm wouldn't abandon their attacks merely because their projectiles were intercepted. Furthermore, the immense energy consumption of the laser defense arrays was a critical limitation. Moreover, the Swarm had already deduced the limitations of the arrays through normal means, insufficient numbers and incomplete interception coverage. The relentless barrage of electromagnetic railguns continued with a second and third wave. For the resource-rich Reckon, who drew from an entire star system, such attritional exchanges were welcomed. Despite their success, the 30% of projectiles that evaded interception still inflicted significant damage on the defensive installations of planet rays. While the laser defense arrays prioritized protecting themselves and remained at full operational strength, the destruction of other ground-based cannons left the Reckon feeling frustrated. Chapter 309, Impact. If the Swarm had a logistic space within the Reckon star system, they could have easily remained beyond the range of the Reckon's main cannons, slowly wearing them down over time. Both sides could have ended up in a standoff lasting years, even decades, until the star system's resources were entirely depleted. But there were no ifs. The Swarm had to capture planet rays before the metal elements inside their primordial bodies were completely depleted. After launching more than 20 rounds of attacks, the primordial bodies finally entered the range of the Reckon's main cannons. Having endured constant bombardment for so long, the Reckon forces were eagerly awaiting this moment and immediately issued counterattack orders. The ground-based cannons on planet rays opened fire first. However, since their energy systems prioritized the laser defense array, only 80% of the cannons could operate. Even so, the remaining operational cannons numbered in the tens of thousands. Their rapid rate of fire filled the sky with red beams of light, creating a display far more spectacular than the silent, invisible barrages of electromagnetic projectiles. Faced with the incoming barrage of red beams, the primordial swarm adjusted their formation. They reduced energy allocated to their electromagnetic cannons, slowing their firing rate, and diverted most of the power to their engine organs. Operating at full capacity, the engine organs enveloped the primordial bodies in flickering blue electric arcs, dramatically enhancing their speed. The sudden acceleration caused the previous barrage of energy beams to miss entirely. "Hold them back!" Hamis roared. The Reckon fleet, previously concealed behind planet rays, and the orbital rail cannons repositioned themselves and joined the fray. The main turrets rotated, adjusted their angles, and began firing immediately. The previously disadvantaged number of main energy cannons multiplied several times over, creating an overwhelming cascade of red beams that seemed to dye the starry void crimson. On the other side, the primordial bodies, encased in crackling blue light, charged forward with unwavering determination, facing even fiercer resistance. The clash of red and blue light created dazzling explosions against the dark starry backdrop, a grimly beautiful and awe-inspiring sight. Yet this beauty came at a cost of countless lives. This wave of attacks, owing to its intensity, incapacitated over 20 primordial bodies. Though not irreparably damaged, they required time to regenerate while drifting in space. However, the mature bodies and larval bodies they carried suffered collateral damage. The larger mature bodies, with more fungal strains, sustained only injuries. In contrast, over a dozen of the smaller, 20-30 meter long larval bodies were destroyed. For a swarm numbering in the tens of thousands, such losses were negligible. The blue-lit charge continued relentlessly. By the third volley, the Reckon's supercomputers had adjusted their targeting parameters, and the closer range allowed the energy beams to strike faster. About 20% of the primordial body's evasive paths were now effectively blocked. With no alternative, these units were forced to charge straight through the barrage. This wave of red and blue collisions left over 300 primordial bodies incapacitated, with thousands of mature and larval bodies obliterated. The Reckon's energy cannons had a high rate of fire, and the fourth barrage followed swiftly. At the now reduced range, nearly 500 primordial bodies were incapacitated, while over 2,000 mature and larval bodies were destroyed. During the Reckon's 4 salvos, the primordial bodies managed to squeeze in a single counterattack. Tens of thousands of electromagnetic projectiles were launched, forcing some Reckon warships to evade and disrupting their firing rhythm. A few sluggish orbital rail cannons were also destroyed, but there were no significant gains. The Reckon's 5th barrage arrived, with red and blue beams clashing once again. This wave left nearly 800 primordial bodies incapacitated, along with the loss of over 3,000 mature and larval bodies. However, before the 6th barrage could land, the primordial bodies reached the effective combat range of the mature bodies. The sides of the space octopuses split open, releasing one mature body after another. Ranging from 20 meters to over 100 meters in size, the deployment instantly multiplied the swarm's effective forces. Relieved of their burden, the primordial bodies accelerated again, surging past the coverage of the 6th barrage. The red and blue beams barely collided this time, with the Reckon achieving little beyond destroying a few hundred trailing mature bodies. The recalibrated parameters of the 7th barrage, however, achieved more substantial results. Another fierce clash of red and blue light left nearly 1,000 primordial bodies incapacitated, hundreds of mature bodies destroyed, and uncounted larval body losses. But before the 8th barrage arrived, the primordial body swarm entered the operational range of the larval bodies. If the earlier deployment of mature bodies resembled a snake emerging from its lair, this was akin to a swarm of bees bursting from a hive. An enormous wave of larval bodies poured out of the primordial bodies, darkening the space around them. Despite earlier losses, their numbers still exceeded 1 million. Among the primordial bodies, over 8,000 remained operational after enduring the barrages. Of these, 5,000 halted their advance to stabilize their positions and resumed firing electromagnetic projectiles, the crackling arcs of electricity illuminating the battlefield as countless projectiles streaked toward the Reckon orbital cannons. Unlike their earlier rushed shots during high-speed maneuvers, this round of stable firing achieved significantly higher accuracy. The projectiles targeted the orbital cannons' bulky, slow-moving structures with no laser defense arrays, making them ideal targets. Meanwhile, the remaining 3,000 primordial bodies clustered together, forming a layered meat shield defense. Groups of 100 units created over 30 layers of protection, presenting an imposing barrier at the forefront. Behind this wall, the mature and larval bodies regrouped, safely sheltered from the Reckon's line of fire. With the current trajectory of the Reckon's beams, penetrating all 30 defensive layers was nearly impossible, leaving the smaller combat units unscathed. Unburdened and fully operational, the primordial bodies surged forward again, their blue electric arcs flashing intensely as they shielded the advancing mature and larval bodies. "Stop them at all costs," came the frantic orders. The Reckon defense systems, assisted by supercomputers and artificial intelligence, recalibrated targeting parameters, adjusted turret angles, and completed these adjustments in a matter of moments. But by this time, the electromagnetic projectiles had already arrived. Predictably, the unprotected orbital rail cannons were devastated, with over 1,000 destroyed in a single volley. As the combatants drew closer, the flight time advantage of the Reiken's energy beams began to diminish. Over longer distances, the difference between several minutes for projectiles and half an hour for energy beams was significant. But as the gap closed, the difference between 3 minutes and a few dozen seconds became negligible. When the swarm's primordial bodies unleashed their second round of long-range support fire, the Reiken's retaliatory energy beams reached the swarm's forward units simultaneously. If earlier collisions of red and blue light resembled scattered beams, now they clashed like spears of condensed energy. The swarm's 30-layer defensive formation lost its first 2 layers instantly, with dozens of primordial bodies reduced to fragments, becoming the first casualties of the battle. The remaining 100 or so primordial bodies in the first layers were also severely damaged. Yet they had no chance to play dead and regenerate. The next defensive layers pushed them forward, forcing them to continue advancing. These heavily damaged units would serve as the front-line defense for the next wave of red energy beams, sacrificing themselves to provide one final contribution to the swarm's assault. Chapter 310, Chaos. The primordial bodies forced to the front line had portions of their structures charred and carbonized. As they moved at high speed, the carbonized fragments broke apart and scattered. In the near-frictionless environment of space, these debris fragments would travel vast distances. The 9th wave of cannon fire arrived, allowing these sacrificial units to fulfill their final purpose. Thanks to their sacrifice, while the 3rd layer of defense was completely obliterated, the 4th layer sustained only minor damage. Are they completely unafraid of death? Concentrate all firepower. Stop them from advancing. This tactic of using physical bodies as shields to cover an assault was something only a force like the Swarm, with its unique organizational structure, could employ as a standard strategy. For civilizations like the Reiken, any commander attempting to use such a tactic routinely would have been court-martialed long ago. Yet, there was no denying the effectiveness of the strategy. As the bulk of the Reiken firepower was drawn toward these meat shields, the 5,000 primordial bodies in the distance could fire their electromagnetic projectiles with impunity. The Reiken forces, forced to respect these tens of thousands of projectiles, had no choice but to dodge. This, in turn, disrupted their firing rhythm. The cascading effects of this strategy allowed the Meat Shield Battalion to breach the Reiken's defensive line after sacrificing only 26 layers of their formation. Faced with the onslaught of the space octopuses, the Reiken warships dared not engage directly. They began retreating, opening their hangar base to deploy waves of fighters. The current generation of Reiken warships not only carried several hundred mainline fighters and drones per ship but were also equipped with a new type of miniature drone. These new drones, measuring only 2.5 meters in length, were smaller than some missiles. In fact, their design and functionality were strikingly similar to missiles. Externally, they resembled missiles with small wings attached. Apart from a small caliber autocannon mounted on their undersides, they lacked any other long-range firepower. Most of their internal structure, aside from the radar in the nose and the engine in the tail, was packed with explosives. These drones were specifically developed as a countermeasure to the larval bodies, which favored close-quarters combat. They deployed alongside fighter squadrons. Due to their small autocannon caliber, they posed little long-range threat to the larval bodies, serving instead to harass, obscure vision, and increase the swarm's computational burden. However, when larval bodies closed in on the fighters, these drones would actively intercept. If a larval body used its tentacles to grab them, they would promptly revert to their primary function as bombs. Thanks to the sheer quantity of these miniature missile drones, the 3 fleets, comprising over 2,000 warships, launched nearly 100,000 fighter jets and approximately 500,000 miniature drones. A total of 600,000 mechanical units surged forth like a dark tide to meet the swarm's mature and larval bodies. In terms of sheer momentum, they did not appear at a disadvantage. As the two sides closed to within 200-300 kilometers, the Reiken fighter formations suddenly braked sharply in space, coming to a synchronized halt. The primordial bodies at the forefront of the swarm's assault still formed several layers of resilient meat shields. With the firepower of the fighter squadrons, breaking through these defenses head-on would be nearly impossible. A direct clash would likely result in catastrophic losses for the fighter squadrons. Furthermore, the fighter formations were meant to serve as harassing units, not to engage the space octopuses in close quarters combat. After their abrupt halt, they dispersed widely, forming a massive net-like formation to wait for the swarm forces to approach. The swarm forces, however, showed no intention of avoiding the trap. The space octopuses charged straight into the web. As the swarm's vanguard breached the fighter formation's net, the fighters launched a fierce assault from all directions on the space octopuses. Countless red energy beams streaked through the starry void, targeting the swarm units. Among these were the small-caliber autocannons of the miniature drones, which, while lacking in direct destructive power, added to the dazzling chaos of lights that disrupted the swarm's movements. Many larval bodies, attempting to avoid these autocannon barrages, were struck by the fighter squadron's energy beams, sustaining severe injuries. Fortunately for the swarm, the sheer number of larval bodies ensured that the losses were negligible. Larger mature bodies moved to the outer edges of the formation, using their bodies to shield the smaller units from these attacks. Eventually, after several salvos from the Recon's main cannons, the primordial meat shield was shattered. Deprived of their formidable shields, the remaining mature and larval bodies could no longer withstand the main cannon fire. As the next wave of cannon fire loomed, the swarm forces voluntarily dispersed. Without the cohesion of a tight formation, their charge ground to a halt. The dispersed vanguard was soon entangled by the fighter squadrons, unable to advance further. In response, the swarm quickly adjusted their tactics, ordering the mature and larval bodies to attack freely, prioritizing the elimination of the fighter squadrons while continuing to push forward. Recognizing this tactical shift, the Recon redirected their main cannons away from the vanguard and aimed at the 5,000 distant primordial bodies, which had been firing uninterrupted, systematically destroying the Recon's orbital cannons. The Recon's decision to retarget was driven by necessity. Continuing to fire their main cannons at the smaller swarm units felt like using cannons to kill mosquitoes, inefficient and wasteful. Meanwhile, the long-range primordial bodies posed an existential threat, with their unrelenting barrages wreaking havoc. With the Recon's long-range firepower now focused on them, the primordial bodies were forced to adopt erratic movements, increasing the Recon's computational load and reducing the likelihood of being hit. However, this also impacted the accuracy and firing rate of their own projectiles. The Recon fleet faced similar constraints. Forced to keep moving to avoid the destructive electromagnetic projectiles, they found it increasingly difficult to maintain precise targeting. As a result, the battlefield split into two distinct zones, long-range units clashing at a distance and close-quarters skirmishes between the vanguard forces. At a range of 100 kilometers, the fighting in the vast expanse of space was effectively close combat. The Recon's original plan to maintain distance and use long-range firepower to gradually wear down the swarm proved difficult to execute. The battlefield had become an uncontrollable maelstrom. Chaos reigned as combatants from both sides filled every direction. It was common for a unit to lock onto a target tens or even hundreds of kilometers away, only to be blindsided by another enemy unit mere meters away. Amid such disorder, the lack of reliable reference points made it impossible to gauge distances accurately. No unit could guarantee that all enemy forces within a 360-degree radius were safely out of range. This led to situations where a Recon pilot, focused on outmaneuvering a swarm unit and maintaining a safe distance of several kilometers, would suddenly be ambushed by a third party and killed in an instant. The sheer scale and complexity of the battlefield created an overwhelming computational load. Even the Recon's supercomputers were unable to issue real-time alerts for all unexpected developments.